I want to first thank Cedric Brand Protection, who are sponsoring the 2024 webinars. We appreciate their support, and this year we'll be doing 12 webinars, so we have a really packed schedule. I want to show you just what we've got for the rest of the year after this program. In September, we'll be doing advanced discussion on the instructions, which we talked about basic stuff earlier. In October, we'll be talking about an interesting issue that kind of popped up this year, at least in my world, about consumers trying to defraud manufacturers during recalls, and what can we do to prevent that. In October, there'll be an update with two CPSC lawyers, Jennifer Keenan and Sherry Falvey. We'll be talking about update on CPSC activities from their perspective. In November, our president for SPSP, Don Mays, will be interviewing or having a conversation with Peter Feldman, who is one of the CPSC commissioners. And just change this, the lawyers in London from the Cooley law firm are going to give us an update in December on the general product safety regulations. These regulations will become effective in December, and there's all kinds of detailed questions. We had the Cooley folks did a presentation in June, generally describing things, and a million slides to go over it. But we're going to, in December, have them hone in on some of the questions that people have had over time. And I think you'll, if you're selling in Europe or in the UK, you'll want to hear that. So that's our schedule for the remainder of the year. So I want to introduce our two speakers for today. Renee Kalmes is a principal scientist from Exponent. She is a certified industrial hygienist and works a lot exclusively with chemicals and products with chemicals. And she will be excellent for giving you the technical aspects of these things. And next, Will Troutman is a partner at the Norton Rose Fulbright Law Firm. He's in the Los Angeles office, and he focuses on regulatory compliance and product safety involving lots of products, but particularly with chemicals and products that use chemicals. So I think we've got two great speakers who will hopefully not confuse us. I'm not a chemical expert. I dabble in it, which is probably dangerous, but it's very confusing, and the regulations are kind of crazy stuff. So I think we'll start the presentation, and I'll turn it over to Renee.
Right. Thank you. Good morning and afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Ken, for inviting Will and I to be part of this. We're excited to talk a little bit about approaches and how to have a safe product, focusing on chemicals. If you can go ahead with the slides. It's interesting because I'm sure we all who are sitting here today have been involved in this for decades. And for grins, I went and looked on some recalls over the past 6 months. And obviously, we are still in the game with ensuring that chemicals are safe. We get product recalls still with some metals and jewelry products and consumer products, craft products, even in some inaccessible areas. So I'm going to take a different approach. Next slide, Ken. And I'm going to kind of walk us back to what does this really mean when we all want to have a safe product? And what does safe really mean? And it's actually a term that I don't try to use a lot in the world of risk assessment and toxicology and exposure, because it has such different meanings to many different people. So in the scientific world, it's really nice. We have a really nice definition of it. It's kind of quantitative. In the scientific world, what it means is that we're going to have a product that is not expected to produce any kind of adverse health effects, right? That's what we all want. Therefore, you have to minimize the risk, and the risks must be avoided. In my world, risk is a combination of two things. The hazard, which is the toxicity, which we're kind of familiar with, and the exposure. So it's not just, this is a chemical, it's on a list because it's deemed to be a carcinogen, or this is a chemical, it's on a list because it's an irritant, but also, what is the risk of that? Because I also have to consider exposure. And hazard, I just want to say a couple things about hazard. And again, I'm not being too technical here, but every single chemical has toxicity, every chemical. Water has toxicity. You can have too much of it and you can overwhelm the sodium potassium portions of our body, and it's deleterious. So it's not that chemicals have some toxicity and hazard. It's also understanding, how can I be exposed to that? Under what conditions? Does it happen? Could it happen? Will it happen? Next slide. Now, for me, I understand that because that's the scientific world. I understand from many of the viewers here that there's also another aspect of safe. It's like, I want to avoid certain things. I want to avoid a recall. I want to avoid people saying anything my brand. I want to avoid litigation. So from another standpoint, safe can mean I want to avoid all these types of risks. So safe means different things to different people. Next slide. So how did we get here? Well, really, chemicals are regulated because of their hazards, right? We're not just willy-nilly picking out a chemical. There's a reason for it. Most of it, 95% of these things are regulated because of chronic toxicity. In other words, there's studies out there that says it's a cancer-causing agent. Well, that takes a long time. It's an exposure that occurs regularly, continuously over a long time. And we're familiar with these. That's not a good chemical. You don't want a chemical that can cause cancer or other kind of chronic health effects. So that's probably the primary reason that we're regulating these chemicals. The other is environmental considerations. We're probably familiar with persistent, bioaccumulative, and toxic chemicals that have been around. We're going to hear a lot about that more in the world of PFAS. Some chemicals are regulated because they're sensitizers. They can be skin allergens, hexavalent chromium, nickel, and jewelry, and other effects such as corrosivity or irritation, not quite as much. But the reason that we're regulating these chemicals is because there has been some study, most likely an animal study, that shows that it can cause some kind of adverse effects at a certain amount. It's not just that it's there, but it has to be at a certain amount, or we could say a certain dose. Next slide. So how do we get here? Well, we have all kinds of agencies, right? We have European agencies have been working on this for decades. REACH, we have CPSC focusing on restrictions and bans, Federal Hazardous Substances Act, which is really not, it's more of a labeling, but you have to understand the hazards to know what label you put on. Do I put on danger? Do I put on warning? That has to do with the hazard of the chemical, not the exposure, but the hazard of the chemical. Then there's the crazy world of Prop 65, which I do a lot of work in, the list, the 900 chemicals. It's not a reformulation standard. It's not a safety standard. It's a warning regulation. So it's about putting the warning on. Now we all know it's morphed into that since I've been working on this since the mid 80s. Hard to believe it's been around that long. But that stirred a lot of action because we have now a list that has a lot of chemicals and it's considered the bad list. And you don't want to have those chemicals in your products, but it's not that simple. We have other state regulations that are obviously banning and warning. We have TSCA prohibitions. And then we have some non-authoritative lists that from a scientific standpoint, we are aware of from the standpoint of certain endocrine disruptors or other endpoints. Next slide. So how are they developed? Well, they're developed based on hazard, which means there's some toxicity testing. And those approaches are risk-based. They can be used to look at the toxicity and the exposure and come up with a level. Most of these quote unquote safe levels are in terms of part per million or a milligram per kilogram. That's what we want to know. We want to know there's a level of, I want to be below that level. If I'm above that level, I may have to do certain things. But also, in addition to these kind of scientific risk-based approaches, there's many that we've come to adopt based on litigation, based on reformulation settlements, consent judgments, a lot in the world of Prop 65. Some are based on feasibility. The industry has gotten together and said, hey, this is what we can do. This makes sense. We can detect it. We've got analytical considerations. Some are based, we can't get lower than this analytically. hexavalent chrome in leather is a great example for that. That's how it started, and there's some movement to lower that. But others are, I don't want to say arbitrary, but they're kind of arbitrary cutoffs. You know, when you look at phthalates, that came from the beginnings of the OSHA global harmonizing system, where that's the cutoff that you use to include a chemical on your safety data sheet. It's 0.1% for carcinogens and reproductive developmental toxicants. It's 1% for all other chemicals. So some of these got here because, you know, it's easy cutoff, and everyone's kind of adopted that as the safe level. There's also environmental considerations, and what I call kind of the precautionary principle is kind of the, let's look at all of these numbers, let's put them all down here, let's pick the lowest one. If we pick the lowest ones, then we're kind of meeting all these things. So let's just do that. Now, obviously, there's some concerns with that because it may not be particular to your product. And without knowing what it's based on, you're thinking it's a health safety concept that you're protecting to, and it really has nothing to do with that. Next slide, please. So I do want to mention one thing, because these risk-based approaches, which are commonly used, but there is a focus over time that's changed. I just want to mention this because, you know, you keep finding different endpoints. So we are now regulating on things that we never thought we would regulate on 20 years ago. You know, it's a carcinogen, we understand it, it's got a toxic endpoint. Now, in the world of science, we're looking at all these different kinds of endpoints, like that we see in animals, behavioral endpoints, follicular, on the follicle, on the enzyme level, that we don't even know how it has any evidence to humans, but we're seeing these endpoints. And from a precautionary principle, we're seeing some of these risk-based levels continue to go down. We also are seeing increase, obviously, in public's perceptions of hazard, because, you know, most of the public doesn't understand that there's hazard and exposure. It's just, it's a chemical, it's bad, we want it out. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but we're seeing more and more of that perception of hazard versus understanding the risk. And then there's some policies out there. You know, there is a movement of just eliminate it, get rid of it. Why even put it in the life cycle analysis? Just get rid of it. So that's why we continue to see some of these ratcheting of these levels going down lower and lower. Not necessarily based on science, but based on other policy type decisions. Next slide, please. So who provides these? Well, we have government agencies, and we've talked about these. They kind of get ratcheted down. I want to talk a little bit about industry then taking some of these and using these in restricted substance lists. Next slide. Because as you all know, there's numerous companies as well as associations, you're probably all involved in some of those, that have developed RSLs and testing requirements for consumer industrial products. And in addition to the regulatory and the toxicological consideration, they're also looking at brand requirements that are also set. And to some degree, these RSLs in some instances have more power than the state and federal regulations, because if you can't meet these RSLs, you can't get that product into the retailer. And so they are kind of guiding this. They also are, in terms of part per million, these levels, they've come from these different sources. The transparency of the basis for those have somewhat been lost in some of these RSLs over time. They may have known that early on, but RSLs have gotten so large and big and encompassing that you sometimes just have a number and a test method, and that becomes the word. A couple things about the RSLs. They're very good as a starting point. They're very good at screening levels. They often need some type of, if you exceed them, obviously I think, and most of these recognize that you do need some specific product assessment of that. Exceedances does not necessarily indicate that the product is not safe, right? I mean, these are guidance and benchmark levels. But again, you know, when a number's out there, it becomes more than a number. It kind of becomes like the line in the sand. And these levels were never, many of these levels were never intended to be that. The other thing I want to mention is that with these RSLs come testing methods. And these testing methods, that because you're getting the data in part per million, so you can compare it to a part per million safe level. The testing methods are intended to really extract the chemical from that matrix. They are not intended to evaluate exposure. They're not intended to look at, well, what really comes off, what gets dislodged, what gets wiped off, what comes off in leaching, what could come out on your mouth. They are meant to extract the chemical with sometimes very aggressive methods. So yes, they're very useful. They're very good for screening. It's a very good starting point, but it doesn't get at safety. It doesn't get at harm. It doesn't get necessarily at a concern of if I'm above this, that there's something wrong. Next slide, please. So just think about when you think about where these fit in the life cycle analysis. If I start at the bottom here, where it's actually in the product already, yes, these levels are sometimes intended, and we hope that they are protecting us from consumer exposure, and then along the pathway to environmental impacts as well. But if we start at the very top, which is the restricting the chemical use in a life cycle process, when we actually get the material, we're seeing more and more of emphasis in this starting point, where if we just don't put it in, we don't have to worry about it impacting consumers because it's not in there, or it's restricted to such degree that we don't even have to get to consumers or to environmental. Next slide. And I wanted to mention this, maybe a few of you were involved in this a couple of years ago. I've heard about it, but a couple of years ago, Skittles made the news because there was a quote unquote known toxin that was using titanium dioxide. Titanium dioxide is a known inhalation hazard. Yes, if you breathe titanium dioxide at high enough levels for a long enough time, it can cause some cancer impacts. This particular use of this, though, has nothing to do with inhalation. We're not breathing the titanium dioxide. It's on a very small part of the Skittles. It has specifications for food, and FDA has evaluated this. There's no evidence of any kind of hazard from food ingestion. It's only an inhalation hazard. But people don't see that, right? They just see, oh, there's a bad chemical in here. And in Europe, they're evaluating the titanium dioxide kind of as an entity in itself. And there's some proposals out there to ban nanoparticles in general. And titanium dioxide would fit into a nanoparticle because, again, it's only an inhalation issue. And so this is kind of an example of getting it on the early end of restricting and banning it. It's a different objective. It has nothing to do with safety of a product. It has nothing to do with, are you harming the environment or the consumer in a particular use? It's just keeping it out of the life cycle. So it's meeting more kind of a policy aspect of it. Next slide. So I think you can see, and you probably are aware, that compliance approaches probably going to differ depending on what that safe level guideline is based on. So if we take something simple like CPSC and jewelry and state regulations where, it's a children's product, there's a law out there, you have to meet it. Honestly, the thing there is probably testing, right? I mean, there's very little ability to look at a risk approach. Is someone going to actually handle it a certain way because the law already considers that this could accidentally get ingested, right? It might not, if we're talking about adult jewelry, that might not be the pathway, but they kind of considered that. So it's really about testing. And Ken shared this with Will and I earlier, a couple of weeks ago, and it's an example of, getting into litigation, not just CPSC, but, litigation based on consistently not having the type of backup needed to demonstrate that you're meeting this regulation. And although the fine is kind of nominal, the big impact is that part of the resolution was to enhance their sampling. Use different third-party rotating labs, have someone check it, can't just rely on international labs. So this kind of has a big bang for your buck when it gets to the point of how one does that compliance testing. So that's kind of an example of that type of approach. Next slide, where if we turn over to the world of crazy Prop 65, it's a completely different kind of approach because it's not at all about a content level and a ppm level. It's all about exposure. And exposure has to do with how a person's going to handle a chemical, how they're going to use it, And the safe levels are not in a part per million. They're in micrograms per day. And everyone struggles with this because how do you go from one to the other? Over time, there are some well-recognized chemicals like phthalates and lead, and even cadmium to some degree that's been around, and there's been several consent judgments. So there are some, very few, that have morphed into a content level of part per million, 0.1% for phthalates, but the rest of them are all based on microgram per day, not part per million. So it's always been a struggle. Just tell me what the level has to be so I'm in Prop 65 compliance. And it's not that simple. So the labs don't tell you what that number is. It usually requires some type of a different type of assessment. Labs have kind of taken, you know, or any kind of, not just labs, but people have taken these kind of values and looked at, again, looking at the lowest one is have chosen that. Let's just make that our safe level because this is the lowest one that's out there. But, you know, I'm sure you've heard beware of this because you may end up selecting something that you think is safe, but has nothing to do with your product because you have to think about how a person is exposed to it. Obviously, for Prop 65, best strategy, I wouldn't say best, I should say the end strategy is you can label it, but there, in many instances, there's no reason to do it. It's not good for the brand, and it just defeats the whole purpose of over-labeling. So this is kind of more of a risk-based approach that is used for determining those safe levels in the compliance. Next slide. And another one that is kind of a morph of both of them is you know, potential recalls, because if you have a recall, even in the law, it says if you're recalling, it doesn't indicate that you're actually posing a hazard, any kind of threat. So there clearly is an opportunity to understand that exposure and address that. Very, very important for contextualizing it, not only to the regulators, but to your clients and the consumers that are using this. Because again, you can look at headlines, all they see is toxin when they're really saying, but it's not accessible. You can't get to it unless you take a hammer and a chisel and open this thing up. All those things that get lost. And so there is opportunity for a risk-based approach in those. Next slide. So I always get the question, well, it's on a list. I don't want any chemical on the list. Let's just not use that. Well, that's all good and well, but it's pretty impractical. And if we keep doing that, we're gonna end up in a mecca of the Hess, as they say. It's difficult, it's costly, and I think what you're gonna hear a lot about is these regrettable substitutions because you get rid of it because it's not a cancer causing, but you know, then we find out 10 years later, it's got a different kind of toxic endpoint. I mean, we're never gonna know all the answers ahead of time, but we do know how chemicals work, some of the structural standpoint, and we can clearly see kind of what's gonna happen down the pipe. You know, it may meet a level, and a lot of people we did this through BPA. Let's make it BPA free. Let's get rid of it. And now we're all talking about BPS and other biphenyls. So we got rid of BPA, and we're dealing with the same kind of issues now with BPS. And we've learned a lot from BPA, and we're hopefully carrying that into BPS. So there is some caution about just eliminating a chemical, especially when there's no point to do it, when you can have levels that are protective of all of those endpoints, consumers and environment. Okay, next slide. So the take-home messages is, you know, I just kind of want to start back with like the fundamentals of safe does not mean the same thing. And it's not always rooted in the best science. If you're below it, probably no harm. If above it, it does not indicate that there is any harm, perhaps. And although I know it's really hard sometimes to understand the transparency, it's really important to understand, especially when you're developing your own brand specific levels, because if you are above that, you need to understand what that means and what the steps might be and how important it is to, you know, that safety factor that you may have built in there. Levels and actions are becoming more and more influenced by non-scientific considerations, policy, public perception. However, it's so crucial to understand the risk when you're explaining this potential for harm. And also, you know, I've got to plug beware of regrettable substitutions. Like I said, we're going to be hearing about this a lot. Next slide. So on the horizon, same things you've probably been hearing: accountability, transparency, especially in testing, documentation of that testing. It's very difficult. We have all these matrices of trying to follow the different laws and the regulations. Difficult and ever changing. I've been in the Prop 65 world for decades. I never thought it would get to this point. I thought we would resolve all these things. It's not going away. We're getting plaintiffs group that continue to enter the stage. And I would be remiss if I didn't say that four-letter word, PFAS, which you're going to hear about for years to come. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Will, who's going to talk more about how do we deal with these strategies for compliance.
Thanks so much. I'd like to start by thanking Ken and the Society of Product Safety Professionals here for inviting me to speak with you today, and also to commend Renee on a great presentation. Demystifying what these compliance obligations actually mean from a technical perspective is no easy feat. And I'm going to pick up here where Renee left off by talking about strategies for safety and compliance through the legal lens. Looking at the attendees here, I see a lot of really accomplished compliance professionals. This talk is really a glimpse into how a compliance lawyer views safety, risk, and compliance. Some of this may be review for many of you, but hopefully you'll be able to get some pearls out of it. And at the end, Renee and I are going to discuss how to respond to an unexpected test result for chemicals compliance. Next slide, please. So just to set the context here, this is obviously somewhat of a silly chart, but I think it really exemplifies that, realistically, you just can't do everything when it comes to product safety and compliance with regard to chemicals. Even the most committed company can't apply equal and appropriate resources to every single requirement. And even if they did, there'd still be mistakes. So how do you approach this? My advice from the legal perspective is you really need to concentrate your efforts on areas with high safety and quality risk and high compliance risk. So meaning, if something goes wrong, is there a high likelihood of injury or other type of harm to to consumers or to the environment? As well as on the other end, on the other axis there, a high compliance risk. Is there likely to be a lot of enforcement? And then on down the line, focusing on areas with high safety and quality risk, even if there's little to no compliance risk and so on. While it may seem cynical to talk about factoring enforcement risk into decision-making, whether that's risk from public enforcers like CPSC, state attorneys general or district attorneys, or private enforcers bringing class actions, or even just reputational risk with consumers and the public, it's the practical reality of deciding how to prioritize when time and resources are limited. So if you think about chemical safety and a number of the issues that Renee talked about and that you all have probably been living over the last 10 plus years, I would call that red band a must, where you have enforcement risk and safety risk meeting up. Those are really where you should focus your efforts if you are either getting started or reassessing your company's approach to compliance, and then moving on down the matrix there. Next slide, please. So to further exemplify the point about having realistic goals for compliance and prioritizing efforts, this slide just lists a few of the numerous chemicals compliance regimes that apply here, ranging from federal requirements under the Consumer Product Safety Improvement Act to Prop 65 to the various state PFAS bans that are continuing to keep cropping up in more and more states. And looking at this chart, we see that at this point, there really isn't a chemical compliance obligation that does not hit the entire supply chain, posing the risk of significant penalties and enforcers. This list also includes some of the laws I see more frequently enforced or expect to see more frequently enforced, starting from top to bottom. I'm not going to go over each of these in detail, but just really highlights the daunting task we have here in front of us. Next slide, please. So in the face of so many requirements, I find the following are key strategies for approaching compliance for safety. First, a company really has to understand its risk profile. Once the risk appetite's determined, it can then assess its approach to compliance. I recommend that the approach be standardized as much as possible, and then once it is, that the approach be reviewed and audited to assess its effectiveness and identify opportunities for continuous improvement. Finally, these laws and regulations are continually evolving, perhaps now more than ever. And there's an expectation that your companies will know everything at all times. As a result, it's really crucial to establish an approach to knowledge that helps the company stay ahead of the game. I'm going to talk about each of these points a little bit in turn here. Next slide, please. So the first step in achieving compliance for safety is to understand your company's risk profile. This is a really complex question that incorporates a number of factors. Some of them I've listed here and I'll talk about a little bit. And again, these are what tend to come up in my experience from a legal perspective and compliance counseling. So first and perhaps most important is understanding how your companies succeed. If you're a public company or a private company, the risk profile is completely different. The decision makers are different. The pressures that apply to you are different. Whether the business is a luxury brand, off-price retail or a discount, or whether you're a supplier and you're supplying to luxury brands off-price or discount, those are going to certainly factor into risk as well. Outside of that approach, you have the question of whether you're selling online only, in stores, or both. That's really going to determine whether you're subject to the laws and requirements of all states or a subset in all countries. If you're national, regional, or international, if you sell products into California, where I'm located, you have a difficult compliance road. But if you're only in certain states, compliance may be easier to manage. And international distribution is also a key driver and one that I'm seeing become a bigger and bigger issue for many of my clients. We're largely discussing US laws here and US approaches, but if you're selling your product into other countries, there may be far more that needs to be considered. The next question is really, from a risk perspective, what are your products? Are they high-risk product types like children's products or health or food products, which are consumed and pose more direct risk? Do you sell a limited range of products or everything? The fewer types of categories you sell, the more likely it is that you can build a really comprehensive compliance program. But if you're really all over in all different sectors, it's going to become harder and harder to have a manageable approach. And within those products, is that mix pretty stable, or does the business consistently look to expand into new areas, with or without your knowledge of the fact that they're doing that expansion? Many of my clients don't find out they're selling new product types until well after they've started being sold. Another key consideration is whether you're selling private label products or just items manufactured and branded by someone else, as that will impact direct obligations as well as a sense of who's responsible for compliance if things go wrong. All these factors are going to feed into risk and impact the approach to compliance. Next slide, please. So beyond your company setup and your product mix, how compliance operates within your company will be a key driver of the risk profile. A really key question here is, who is the boss for compliance? Is the compliance team the ultimate decision maker? Is the legal team? Or are the buyers and merchants? If the buyers are in charge, if compliance and legal are consistently a bump in the road, then buyers are generally going to find another road and start going around you. So it's really important to understand what the drivers of compliance are there to adapt accordingly. Another big consideration is what your budget is, if any. Does the company expect ROI for its spend on compliance? Does it have the appetite to spend on prevention, or only once a risk is ripe? Do you have a team and headcount, or are you just one or two people doing your best to keep your fingers in as many holes as possible? Another key consideration is who your suppliers are. So if you're sourcing domestically or you're sourcing overseas, that absolutely is going to change the risk profile. And there's a big question there in terms of suppliers with regard to relationships and track record. If you've been working with suppliers for a long time with few issues or no issues, this is a little less risky than if you have a consistently new slate of suppliers bringing new types of products in. The types of suppliers are also a key consideration. Are they large or small? Are they sophisticated or flying by the seat of their pants? Do you have visibility into their compliance history? These are all going to factor into risk, including whether and how much you can trust them, and whether or not they can make you whole if something goes wrong. And so each of these considerations are levers, I think, that weigh on the ultimate approach and how you're going to go about doing things. So once you understand your risk profile, you can start to prioritize compliance. Next slide, please. So in my experience, companies tend to fit into one of the few buckets of compliance approaches based on their risks. First, you have companies that want to be market leaders. These are companies that aim to go beyond what is legally required, often because this is their market strategy and how they talk to their consumers. Next, you have companies that look for a highest common factor. That's going to be an approach that they can apply across the spectrum and generally alleviate risk and comply in most or all of the places they do business. In my experience, it's typically difficult for a company to sell one type of product to parts of the US and another type of product to California. And so often there is an effort to find one limit, one level, one consideration, and then apply that everywhere, even if in a particular state it's not required. After that, you have a risk-based approach in which companies assess the risk posed by the various laws and then decide where to focus compliance efforts. You also have companies that I call just in time, and those are the ones that look out for requirements that are either new or pose new risks, and then they spin up compliance approaches pretty quickly to address what is coming next, but it's not really part of a comprehensive approach. And then as we near the end of the list there, you have companies that generally leave compliance alone unless and until a crisis or an event occurs. That tends to drive action, often an overcorrection, and whether that's a product recall or an investigation or a penalty for non-compliance. And then finally, of course, you have companies that have a bit of a hybrid approach, incorporating certain aspects of all of these based on their risk profile and resources. Some other considerations that feed into these types of compliance approaches are whether a company is national or international. As I mentioned earlier, companies distributing consumer products internationally, they typically need to have a more organized and strategic approach. Although I do encounter a fair number of companies that distribute products all over the world, but really only focus on compliance in the US or the US and a couple of other key jurisdictions. It is my experience that of late, more international jurisdictions are spinning up their compliance and enforcement approaches. And so it may be that in the coming years, it is far more important to have a global approach to compliance rather than just a US or North American focus. Another important consideration is if you're a retailer, whether you sell your own private label products or just sell market brand products, as responsibility for compliance can vary greatly based on this. And then finally, whether your products are high or low risk can impact compliance approaches. Products can be higher risk because of the type of product and the population that uses it, like children's products, as I mentioned before, or the type of risk, knowing that if something goes wrong, it's likely to injure people. And then finally, of course, you can have things like the volume of the product can drive risk. So if there are millions of units out there, or just a small number, that can change things. Next slide, please. So what are some options for compliance? When I'm working with clients to set up compliance programs, we really focus on two main issues at the beginning, and that is supplier management, followed by testing approaches. With regard to supplier management, whether you're a retailer, a brand, a manufacturer, or somewhere else in the supply chain, you all have suppliers, and managing them is a crucial part of compliance. You're only as good as the data that's being fed into your systems. So on the slide, I've mapped out some approaches to compliance for suppliers, generally listed, in my view and experience, from the least effort but the least protectiveness to the most effort but likely to yield increased compliance and safety. At the most basic, you have terms and conditions that require a supplier to comply with all applicable laws, including chemicals laws and regulations. This offers some measure of protection, but usually it's only financial, in that if a supplier provides non-compliant products or components or raw materials, you may be able to seek indemnity. If you are working for a company right now and you do not have a standard manufacturing and supply agreement that lays out terms and conditions, in my view, this is a must and something that you should focus on immediately to establish some of these obligations. That said, terms and conditions alone do little to actually ensure a safe or a compliant product. And so we often see approaches with our clients where they provide supplier notices that can be used to advise supply chain partners of new laws or regulations that are coming up. These tend to be ad hoc and focused on perceived high risks. I think right now, no matter where you are in the supply chain, you're either sending or receiving notifications regarding PFAS compliance, whether that's state bans or the EPA TSCA PFAS reporting requirement. That seems to be very much a focus of everyone right now. Another common approach is the compliance manual, in which a company seeks to aggregate all of the various laws and regulations that apply to their products and provide expectations for compliance from suppliers. This can be a desirable approach because it serves to educate suppliers and ensure that they're aware of safety and compliance obligations. But it is a one-way process. You never really know if the manual is being considered, especially after updates. It might seem pretty basic to talk about a vendor manual, but I work with lots of clients that have very detailed instructions on logistics and EDI and where to put labels on packages, but they don't actually set out all of the requirements and provide resources to their suppliers to figure out what those requirements are and where to find out more information. And so given the one-way aspect of vendor manuals and even vendor notices and supplier notices, we're seeing more and more companies that require suppliers to certify compliance with requirements. Obviously, this has to happen with chemicals requirements under the Consumer Product Safety Improvement Act, but many companies extend these to other obligations like Prop 65 and, as I mentioned, PFAS compliance. And then as we get to the right side of the slide, we have more hands-on approaches in which a company provides specifications to its suppliers, defining how or what is needed for compliance, not leaving it to chance that the supplier doesn't know. The plus here is that the company knows the supplier is providing the product in specific accordance with its demands. The risk is that if the company gets it wrong, it really can't blame the supplier. Finally, we are more frequently seeing situations in which the brand or seller establishes a nominated supplier system. That's a closed system in which all parts of the supply chain are vetted and qualified and must be used. I find that this approach can yield really excellent, predictable compliance and safety results. But again, it's only as good as the effort put into it. This can also be a really difficult approach to take if you're a smaller company and can't really force your supply chain to work within your system. Next slide, please. Another key component to a compliance approach is the testing system. Again, we have a wide variety of options and approaches, all of which have different pros and cons. At the most basic, we have the certification approach, in which an upstream entity is expected to test for compliance on its own accord and then certify that it's meeting applicable laws, regulations, and standards. The risk here is that, again, the recipient of the certification doesn't really know whether anything is happening. And therefore, you get a minimum of compliance with regard to that. A step up from that is requiring suppliers to provide a test report demonstrating compliance. This is often just a snapshot in time, and it doesn't really tell you anything about ongoing or subsequent production. It doesn't tell you much about the production universe, only the tested samples. To enhance that, you can seek to have your suppliers implement routine testing programs, establishing minima for frequency of testing, sample sizes, and other factors that tell you more about the product components or materials being received. Beyond supplier testing, there are a variety of approaches that can be taken by downstream entities, ranging from screening or testing prior to shipment, or actually sampling from units that are received, whether components or finished goods. When I talk about screening, I'm typically referring to a shorthand method for assessing compliance, like XRF testing for lead and other heavy metals, or total organic fluorine screening for PFAS. Screening approaches tend to be cheaper or faster, or both, than traditional wet chemistry testing, but they also can yield inconsistent results and incomplete information. For example, screening for total organic fluorine doesn't actually tell you whether you have intentionally added PFAS in a product. It could be an indicator of contamination or other substances with fluorine like pigments. I've also listed a couple of other factors that can weigh in on screening and testing approaches. This includes whether you're looking at compliance solely for legally required elements or industry standards or some mix of both. This also can include, going further to exposure assessments or toxicological risk assessments. That is understanding not just how much of a chemical is in a product and whether it meets a legal standard, but really getting a sense of how it can impact human health or the environment. Next slide, please. So once you've determined the approach, standardization is another key to dealing with complex compliance regimes. It's really, really important that you create a standard and then create an SOP for implementing the standard. The more complex a regulatory system is, the more opportunities there are for humans to screw it up. If you do the same task the same way every time and everybody knows what they're supposed to do, you decrease the risk of error. I've put some opportunities for standardization on the slide there. You would be shocked, or maybe you wouldn't be shocked, the number of times I meet with clients and they tell me how they do things, and I ask where that's written down, and the answer is nowhere. That puts you at great risk for, first of all, personnel changes or other types of disruptions where that knowledge is lost. It also makes it very difficult to respond to regulatory issues when they arise if you haven't actually written things down. Next slide, please. So once you've established the standards process, it's crucial to review and audit it. A common mistake is to make the rules and then just kind of let it ride. It's really important to review and audit data to improve processes over time. It doesn't need to be all or nothing. You can determine appropriate modules to audit, like reviewing just new supplier compliance or just high-risk chemical issues, or just areas where screening methods like XRF are relatively inexpensive and pretty reliable. It's also really important to review and audit your own internal systems and standards as well to ensure they're working and then enhance them as they can. The importance of review and audit is that is at least threefold, if not more. It finds problems before they fester. It demonstrates to regulators that you're serious about compliance, And it also tells you whether the efforts you're putting in are getting results. And that can tie back to that question of, ROI for compliance. Do you have a good system and is it effective? And on the home stretch here, you really need to develop a knowledge base. It's a great opportunity for standardization here as well. These rules and regulations are constantly changing, and you need to rely on the sources around you, many of which I've listed on the slides. And I really recommend also having a standard approach to this, whether it's quarterly or twice a year, periodically updating that knowledge, recording it in the same place and same way every time, and then trying to avoid knowledge gaps. So as we wrap up here, Renee and I are just going to talk quickly about our views on responding to potential non-compliance. Next slide, please. And as we're in the realm of chemicals compliance here, next slide. Sorry, one more. There we go. We're going to focus on what happens when you get unexpected test results, as that tends to be the main driver of non-compliance when it comes to chemicals. So from the legal perspective, my first reaction to getting a bad result is to analyze the test results to confirm whether they're valid and what they tell you. Really a key question here is whether you can replicate the result. One bad test result doesn't necessarily mean a widespread problem. We routinely see outliers, which can result from a variety of causes ranging from lab error to contamination. Renee, anything else to add there?
Yep, I think you got that one covered.
Okay. So then, assuming you can replicate a result, there's a question of what does it really mean? Is it a slight non-compliance? Is it a big miss? Does it mean you might have contamination? Does it mean your suppliers might be misleading you? Does the test failure, if confirmed and supported, mean that you just can't sell a product, or does it mean you need to consider risk? So at that point, we want to consider confirmatory testing. And Renee, I'll turn this one over to you if you want to talk a little bit about how you think about confirmatory testing.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to what you kind of been chatting about as well, Will, is that like, what are you trying to understand here? I mean, obviously I talked about you can have a level. You may not even understand what that level is based on. So it'd be good to know, is that a risk-based? Is it a harmful? Is it a safe level? What's that based on? And then, to think holistically, if you are going to redo the testing, think what other data you're going to get. Just don't try to reconfirm that. But if it is really an exposure, if it's a client issue, if it's a consumer issue, you want to get information that cannot just say, oh, we never found that's just a contamination issue. And by the way, we also looked at, is this even coming off? Is it, think bigger than just addressing that one, because you're probably going to have to address the consumer and the brand and what you're going to tell people about that. So, maybe you do more of an exposure analysis. Maybe you understand if it's going to get wiped off, or does it leach off, and what's it made out of? And, yes, it's there, but it's stuck to the matrix. So there's testing that you can do to address that first issue of being unexpected, but you can also think holistically and while you're doing that, be cost effective and address some of these other issues that can help understand your risk profile.
Yeah, thanks, Renee. And assuming that confirmatory testing, demonstrates that you do actually have a potential problem, the next step there is to assess the non-compliance. And of course, the single most important thing is understanding the risk of harm. Is that non-compliance actually posing risk to consumers or the environment? One of the things that we often see is a lead exceedance of a composition limit, but it's really a few part per million, or even 100 extra part per million, but generally speaking, that is not necessarily going to lead to an immediate risk of harm. And beyond that, the safety issue, there's the question of reputational risk. If you don't take action and the non-compliance issue becomes public, is that damaging to the company, both from the consumer perspective as well as the regulatory perspective? And then finally, again, in particular, from my view, the question of litigation risk. One of the interesting aspects of this type of chemicals compliance I encounter is that we often get test results, we do the exposure analysis, we think about it holistically, we don't think we actually have a problem, but the plaintiff's bar is still going to bring a lawsuit if the product is out in the market. And so there's a question there of whether you you take some action because you're not concerned about actually harming the public, but you're concerned about exposure from a litigation perspective. Renee, anything to add there?
Yeah, and just, just to supplement that, it's the same kind of concept, is that you got to make sure you get all the data that you can to make a good risk business decision. Like many times you throw a warning on it, you settle it, you reformulate it. You don't have to, but you do it because of all of these other reasons, but you don't know that until you gather all this information. And again, from my standpoint, it's really understanding what is that harm that can occur, and what is your benchmark that you're comparing these things to.
Yeah, absolutely. And then finally, of course, once you understand that risk, you have to decide what you're going to do. And often the answer is nothing. It may be that after assessing a non-compliance issue, there really isn't an action to take, or you can fix the problem going forward, but there really isn't anything driving backward-looking action. However, of course, if you're looking at this and you do truly have a risk of harm, there's the potential for reporting obligations, whether that's to CPSC in a Section 15B report, or considering self-disclosure to a regulator at the state level if we think that that's going to mitigate the harm. You also, depending upon where you sit in the supply chain, may have an obligation to inform your supply chain partners about the non-compliance. Particularly if you're supplying to a brand, you may have obligations to tell them what's going on so they can actually weigh in on the action that'll be taken. And of course, there's the ultimate potential actions of having to stop selling the product or enact a recall at the consumer level. Renee, anything further to mention there?
No, I think that's it. I think the only other thing is, it's just regardless of any action you take, at some point you have to contextualize that. Like, what does that mean? You're doing it because, for other reasons, for policy, for good practices, but I think it's prudent to just have that information, regardless if you're recalling it, stop selling it. You have to be telling your consumers something. You have to tell your suppliers something. So get the data that you need so you can contextualize it appropriately. Yep, I think you hit upon them all very well, Will.
Thanks, Renee. All right, that's it for me. Ken, do we have some questions?
Yeah, well, let me, I think I'm on here. Yeah. You can hear me, right?
Yes.
Yeah, got it. Okay, so I'll take questions just a second, but the slides will be posted on the website, link to the video, and any other material, if we provide any additional material, will be at that link. Here are email addresses if you have questions after the program about any of the slides, or looking for a reference material or anything, it should be there in the website. Now, I want to get to questions here. Okay, we have a question. I'll read it. I think, Will, you and Renee can see it if you click on Q&A there. So, but I'll read it because I don't know if anybody else can see it. We've seen in recent years that levels or concentrations of certain chemicals considered acceptable or unsafe have been revised downward, sometimes multiple times. How much of this is driven by advances in analytical chemistry, and how much by the inability of lay stakeholders to accurately assess risk? An example is the approach that asserts that the only acceptable level of an allegedly hazardous chemical is 0.
I can take a quick crack at that. Yes, it's both of those. And there's a third one as well. It's analytical. We're finding things. We're looking for different endpoints of concern from a hazard standpoint. And yes, it's the public perception that they want 0 risk. They want no lead. They have heard for decades now that there's no safe level of lead. That's toxicologically, that's not true, but it is all of those. And we also have the other added measure of litigation, that settlements are ratcheting down lower and lower. Some of it you can't help. As we learn new information, we have to incorporate that. So that's like scientifically appropriate to do. And there's just this overall concept of like, all chemicals are bad and we just have to get rid of them or just bring them down lower and lower and lower. And we are at that point now. I think it's going to be really interesting with PFAS. We're at that point where we can't do it. We just can't do it. So, I mean, simply, it's all of those. And we're losing the science. We're losing the science in this process. We're getting regulations that are just putting numbers in with no basis. And it's just kind of like, we can do it, so let's do it, which, you know, I'm all for, you know, reducing chemicals that we shouldn't have, but there comes a point where it just doesn't work anymore. It's not sustainable, and it's not good for anyone. Plus we're spending efforts on the wrong chemicals then. Like, why do we keep lowering lead when blood levels have gone down dramatically? There's probably other things we need to be putting our emphasis in. So it's all of those.
And I would just add from the, you know, from the legal point of view, I absolutely agree. Part of it is the litigation. You know, a lot of times the lawyers who bring these cases to justify getting their fees, they have to show some public benefit. And so they decrease, you know, if they can get a lower limit in a settlement, they can argue that they've accomplished something. Another piece of it is putting aside the stakeholders, there's a pretty robust NGO community that is focused on, you know, no chemicals. And so it's not that they don't understand risk, it's that their mission statement is no chemicals, and that's what they're driving for. And I think lastly, I don't know if this is really a legal issue, but part of it is that this is largely a one-way conversation right now. I just in my normal life, you know, on the sidelines of like my kid's soccer field, you know, I have parents ask me questions about chemical risk, and they only understand and know the unsafe side of the argument. There's nobody really out there arguing about the benefits of chemicals, and I think PFAS again is a great example. We have all these state bans and now some even that just say by some date, you know, 2030, 2032, no PFAS are allowed. I've yet to see how electronics are going to be produced without PFAS, and nobody's talking about it. The legislators aren't talking about it, and nobody's really holding them to account. So I think that's the other big piece of this.
Yep.
Okay, I have a question. Now, I work in the area of warnings and instructions. I'm not a chemical expert, so I don't do chemical regulatory. And I know enough that when I have a question that comes up from the chemical side, I call Renee and say, tell me, is this chemical hazardous or not? But there are two areas here that are important. That one is, and this is not an OSHA seminar, but workplace safety. I mean, you're manufacturing a product and you are buying chemicals to use in your plant, and you're required under OSHA laws to have safety data sheets. Secondly, then you incorporate chemicals into your product and then you're selling them to consumers. So there are really two regulatory schemes that are dictated by the use of chemicals either in components you're buying or in the plant or in products you're selling. One of the problems I've had over the years is our suppliers won't tell us. Well, they'll tell us what chemical is in it. Sometimes they won't even tell us because that's business confidential information. They don't want it divulged. And so sometimes they'll tell us the chemical, but they don't tell us the concentration. And without the concentration, it's impossible to develop an accurate safety data sheet that complies with OSHA requirements. And secondly, might be difficult in complying with Federal Hazardous Substances Act without knowing, because Renee, you can't figure out the hazard without knowing concentrations as well as the chemicals. So we have a hard, so I guess the question is, what am I supposed to do when my suppliers won't give me both the chemical identification and the concentrations? What am I supposed to do? You guys both can answer that one.
Well, I can speak to what that means in terms of safety data sheets. You've got a different population there. Anyone who makes a chemical is required to assess their hazards. So they don't have to tell you what the ingredient is if it's a trade secret, but the safety data sheet has to represent the hazards. They have to tell you if it's a carcinogen. Well, if it's a carcinogen, it has to be listed, but you know, what kind of toxic endpoint, they have to tell you that if it's above a certain concentration. Now, that is a chemical. That's just one chemical, right? And you're making a product that probably uses several different chemicals, not just one. So it's your responsibility then to take that information that you're getting from those suppliers, and you can rely upon them. You know, you don't have to do anything. You can totally rely what they say and integrate that into your hazard assessment for your end product. Many people will supplement that with testing because they know to agree kind of what's in there. And, you know, nowadays you can test a lot of things. You can kind of even reverse engineer some stuff. You can figure it out. If you're not getting that information from your supplier, that's one way to do it. You know, and there's probably some legal things that Will can talk about is that, but then you own that hazard assessment or you rely upon someone else, and there's some strategy on what you do, because if you do it, then you've taken on that assessment of hazard versus saying, I'm relying upon my supplier. So I understand what you're talking about. You can only get so much from the supplier. You certainly can test. And if you know enough about what's going in it, you kind of can know what to test for.
Will, you got any?
I agree with everything Renee said there, and it is definitely a question of balancing the risks. The best thing you can do is generate, you know, the best thing to know what's going on is to generate your own data, but then you got to do something with it once you have it. So that is always I think from the legal point of view, the question of, do you want to be able to maintain reliance on your suppliers, or do you want to take that on yourself? But if you're not getting it from them, then yeah, testing is really the best approach to figure out exactly what's going on.
And that gets really expensive. And for, you know, small manufacturers who are buying a bunch of component parts, and they don't know what's the concentrations, or sometimes they don't even know what's in there, you know, it gets really difficult. So it's hard to know what to tell people, other than if you don't feel like you can rely on them, they're not giving you adequate information, then don't use them. Use another
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And
right.
That's definitely something that's driving a lot of the move to nominated supplier approaches that I'm seeing, is this idea of the risks are too great now. We just need to have a closed universe of suppliers that we commit to them. Therefore, they'll tell us what we need to know, and then we can feel better about it going forward. But that certainly comes with, you know, there's all sorts of impacts, you know, to that are both from a risk perspective, but also, you know, from a business and cost perspective.
And certainly this issue certainly involves, and we won't talk about it, Proposition 65 issue, because you can't figure out Prop 65 or whether it's one of the 900 chemicals unless they tell you what's in there.
Yeah. But there's some strategies for that, because no one tests for 900 chemicals, and the world of Prop 65 is really boiled down to it's definitely the 80-20% rule.
Okay.
But again, you know, knowing what's in your product is going to continue to be very important.
Well, great. Okay. Well, I want to thank you both very much. Thank you all for attending. Hopefully this was either useful or depressing, or both, one of the two. And we look forward to you attending future webinars. So thank you all very much.
Okay. Thank you.